Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. Today, my colleague and I are going to talk about the work that we did in analyzing the software security of the RPKI protocol toolset. And like the title of our talk suggests, we sadly do not come bearing good news. So the first part of the talk, we're first going to introduce a little bit what RPKI is and why we should care about it. It's still a pretty new protocol, so it's necessary to kind of take it from the top a little bit. Then we're going to talk about the tools and the methodologies that we had to develop from scratch to do the security analysis. We will introduce the results, and at the end, we will share some colorful interactions that we had during the disclosure process. So before we talk about RPKI specifically, we have to very quickly go back to another protocol that we all know, which is BGP. BGP is the core interdomain routing protocol that we have. It's the glue that keeps the internet together, but it is quite vulnerable. And it is vulnerable because at the time when BGP was first developed in 1989, the priorities when developing these protocols were things like efficiency and speed, but not security, because the internet back then was much smaller and used by much less entities. And the internet developed in a way that was, in a way, incompatible with the systems back then. And BGP still doesn't have security guarantees, and it is vulnerable to a variety of attacks, all of which come with a pretty hefty price tag. So the community decided to do something to protect BGP. And of the many protocols that were introduced over time, RPKI seems to be the one that's kind of winning the race. The RPKI protocol is fairly new. It was first created it was first introduced sort of 15 years ago, more or less. And in the past couple of years alone, it has seen very widespread adoption. Major tier 1 providers in the world are using RPKI. Several IXPs have joined in. Big companies have also joined the protocol as well to protect their resources. So it has been a pretty successful protocol. And its success has been so widespread and memorable that even the FCC, just a few months ago, actually, they published a recommendation where, among other things, they were recommending the use of the RPKI in the entire internet infrastructure in the United States, so for all ISPs and broadbands in the US. And next, we're quickly going to go over a little bit how the RPKI works, because this is important context for the rest of the talk. In this slide, we see the representation of the autonomous system as a cloud with a BGP router in it. And here comes the first half of the RPKI infrastructure, which is the RPKI repositories. They are a set of repositories, all distributed, all in a way connected with one another in a tree-like way. And it's important to note that at the root of any RPKI repository tree, there must be one of the 5 regional internet registries. That's important because the content of these repositories has to be cryptographically verifiable data. But we are not just interested in verifying the integrity of the data, but also the source of this information, because then all this information is going to be used to make better routing decisions. And of all the data that RPKI repositories have, ROA is the one that's most important for us at this point. The ROA is a file that contains a tuple with a network prefix and an autonomous system number that is allowed to announce this prefix on the internet. And this is the content that is then going to be used to inform better routing. Now, I said a lot of things here. We have repositories. You have to download data, and you have to do that relatively often because data is changed or things are updated. You have to parse multiple files and do cryptographic validation. All of this is stuff that routers generally don't like to do. So all of this has been outsourced to the relaying party, which is technically the second half of the RPKI infrastructure and the engine of the RPKI. It does all the aforementioned stuff, and in the end, it generates a master file that contains all of these prefix autonomous system number tuples that have been verified, sends them over to the router, and now the router is a little bit smarter than it used to be. Now it's able to tell apart between valid BGP announcements and potential hijacking attacks or BGP leaks. So one thing to sort of take away from this setup is that the relaying party is a piece of software that has to be always available. It has to have an ongoing connection with the router. And if something were to happen to that connection, routers will eventually flush all the data that they have because they cannot guarantee their freshness, and as a result, become, again, vulnerable to attacks. So Nicholas and I are PhD students, which means our day job is essentially pick a protocol, pick a program, and try to break it. And that's what we decided to do with the relaying party implementations out there. And what we did was we took two fairly popular implementations. We started tinkering with them a little bit, and the result was we were able to crush them by using just fairly simple manipulations. And the next step was we wanted to quantify how many entities would actually be affected by the crashes that we found. Maybe it was a negligible amount. It was almost 85% of all relaying parties that had been, at the time, deployed in the world that could be crashed with the vulnerabilities that we found. And so at this point, after finding such big issues with just some very rudimentary manipulations, we decided that it was time to do some systemic analysis, because if we could find something so big with just easy tinkering, maybe a systemic analysis would provide us with more issues. And at this point, I'd like to hand it over to Nicholas, who's going to tell us more.
Yes, thank you, Donika. Right, so this is already bad, right? Because we have two vulnerabilities which are quite easy to find and affect a lot of clients. And this sparked our interest, because if you have such easy to find vulnerabilities, how much could you find when you actually started looking? So at this point, we started to think about how we could conduct a more systemic analysis of the implementations. And we quickly landed on fuzzing as the most promising solution for this, because fuzzing is supposed to be easy to set up. You can test a lot of implementations at once, and you can hopefully find a lot of problems, especially because denial of service is already a big problem, so finding a crash is already sufficient for a vulnerability. And at this point, when we started to think about it, we thought this will probably be quite simple. We use existing software, we run a fuzzer, we find a lot of vulnerabilities, and then we can publish our results. Now, if this is so easy, why has nobody done it? Why were there so easy to find vulnerabilities in the RPKI? And that's a good question, and we didn't know, so we started to look into it. And we made our plan, which we thought would be simple. So we wanted to use existing software, the most suitable fuzzer, install it, use it to generate inputs, and find crashes. Right? So I made a little sketch here to visualize what we were planning. So on the left, we have a person representing the fuzzer, and on the right, we have the relying party implementation represented by a quite unstable house. And now the fuzzer will start to generate objects, throw them at the RP, and trigger some sort of error message, error code, whatever, some sort of indication what happened, and we'll use this indication to generate the next object and throw it at the RP again, trigger some different error message, and keep going until at one point it finds an input which crashes the RP. And this is nice, because when we can crash the RP, we have already found a vulnerability. OK, so far on our simple plan. It turned out that reality wasn't as simple as we had hoped. Because when we started to implement this, when we downloaded the fuzzer, we downloaded the RPs, we started running it, we noticed that we run into a problem. Because when we started the fuzzer, it will generate objects, it will throw them at the RPs, and we would get our first error message, which, fair enough, some error message within the parsing logic of the RP. Now, we kept the fuzzer running, of course, and it turned out that we would always basically get the same error. The object that the fuzzer generated would always fail very early within the validation or the parsing logic of the relying party, and we just couldn't get it to find any vulnerability whatsoever. It was just always getting stuck very early in the processing. Now, at this point, we got a little bit frustrated, because we already spent weeks on this, and we just couldn't get it to run at all. And then we looked into it, and we looked into the RPKI objects, because that's what the fuzzer is generating. It generates objects, RPKI objects, which are input into the relying party. And it turns out that RPKI objects are very complex. So RPKI uses the ASN1 language to define the objects. You might know it from other protocols. For example, in TLS, you will also have ASN1 defined objects. Common format is the X509 certificate format. And in fact, RPKI also uses this format, but each RPKI object contains a X509 certificate. It also contains other data. So the objects are even more complex than X509 certificates. And that's the reason why our fuzzer wasn't able to produce any results, because the objects are so complex that the fuzzer just wasn't able to get close enough to how the objects should look like to get anywhere in the parsing. So I brought an example of a real-world RPKI object here. It's a ROA, or a certificate, sorry. And it might be difficult to see on the monitors, but it's basically 2 kilobytes of data, and you have a lot of structure information. So you, for example, have lists, and you have sets, and you have lists within lists, and so on. So these objects are very complex. Now, this problem by itself would have been solvable, for example, by using a structure-aware fuzzer, but things get worse. Because RPKI uses a technology which makes fuzzing very, very difficult, and that technology is cryptography. Now, cryptography is very nice because it allows you to, for example, create a digital signature of the content of an object. This is nice because it attests that the content hasn't been changed. But the entire thing that a fuzzer is doing is changing the content of the objects, right? So with the signatures, and in fact, every RPKI object is signed, and most of them even have 2 signatures to make it more fun. Now, with the signatures, the fuzzer struggles because it will always automatically break the signature once it changes the content of the object. And so even if parsing succeeds, it will always fail very early in the validation. Now, at this point, we got very frustrated because we just couldn't figure out how we could get it to run. And in the end, there was only one option left to us, which was we had to build one ourselves. We had to build our own fuzzer because how hard can it actually be? Well, it turns out it can be very hard. So we spent 9 months on this, and we wrote over 20,000 lines of Rust code until we finally had something which we could work with. And humble as we are, we called our tool Cure. And in the next slides, I want to go a little bit over the inner workings of Cure and show how we solved the challenges that I brought up. And let's start with the first challenge, with the complexity of the objects and how to generate them. Now, we implemented 2 different object generation modules. The first we implemented was random byte mutation. The concept is quite simple. You use an existing RPKI object, and you just mutate it randomly. So you will add bytes, you will remove bytes, you will swap bytes, and you don't care about the structure, you just change the bytes in the objects. And this part is very good to find vulnerabilities within the parsing logic of the relying parties. Now, the second thing we implemented was the structure-aware mutation part. And this module, basically, we implemented the entire logic of how RPKI objects look like, which was very fun. And it will generate objects which are completely parsable, which means these objects don't fail in the parsing stage, but will get through to validation and then can find vulnerabilities within the validation pipeline of the relying parties. And in the end, it turned out that we needed both of these, because with both, we could find vulnerabilities which the other couldn't find. And in total, we found 18 vulnerabilities within the relying parties. Now let's get to solving the second challenge, the cryptography. So Cure implements a module which we called repositorify. And this module takes the generated object, independent of which of the object generation modules we used, and it will adapt it according to what we need. So it will do all the cryptographic operations, so recompute all the signatures, and it will also add all other necessary fields within the object. So for example, within a ROA object, you have, I think, like 15 fields which need to be adapted, which, for example, is the fingerprint of the parent, or the name of the parent, or the location of the object. all of these fields need to be adapted for the relying party to even begin the processing. And this will all be done within this module. And after the adaptation of the object, it will be placed within a valid RPKI repository, and it will be made available to all the relying parties that we want to test. And that's a big benefit of our setup. It's not implementation specific. So you can connect an arbitrary implementation of an RPKI relying party, and it will be tested with our setup. And with this, we finally have a setup which works for fuzzing relying parties. And with this, I will hand back over to Donika, who will talk about what we have found.
Thank you. So after developing Cure, we had to test it against something. And we didn't want to just pick arbitrary implementations on the internet just for the sake that they were some relaying party implementation. We wanted to actually test the implementations that were being used by companies on the internet. And so we did a measurement where we found out which were the relaying parties people were actually using. And in the slide here, you can actually see the list. So all of the relaying parties, or all of the columns in blue, they are the actively maintained at the time relaying parties that were being used. And after letting Cure run on them for a couple of weeks, we found issues on 3 out of these 4 actively maintained relaying parties. In total, 18 vulnerabilities, of which 5 eventually became CVEs. Now, the first vulnerability type that we found was the path traversal, which affected the Routinator implementation. And if you recall from this earlier slide, Routinator is by far the most widely used relaying party. So the fact that it was vulnerable to path traversal attack is pretty huge problem. And it was also rated at a 9.3 by the vendor in terms of criticality, the CVE. And the main issue with this particular vulnerability is that there were 2 ways you could exploit the path traversal. So in the first way is the typical path traversal exploitation. You take a bad file, you put it in a place where it's not supposed to be, and you try to take control of the host, for example. The other way you could exploit the path traversal is by poisoning the relaying party data, so poisoning the data that is then going to be sent over to the router. This was possible for some versions under certain conditions, so not on all implementations, but it was a possibility in some cases, which is what made this a particularly bad issue. The other type of vulnerability that we found was just the ability to pretty much DOS the relaying parties, crash them, and this was something that we found for all the 3 vulnerable relaying parties on multiple parts of the source code. So Routinator, Octo-RPKI, Fort were vulnerable. And the way to exploit this particular vulnerability in relaying parties is essentially, relaying parties have to periodically do the whole download process, create the master file that is sent to the routers. But if for some reason, every time they boot and they try to download the data and they fail without finishing the entire process, they're not going to be able to establish a connection or create that master file to send over to the routers and eventually stop the communication with them. So we call that stacking the relaying parties in a perpetual fail and restart mode. And this is what the DOS vulnerabilities could cause. So we found these vulnerabilities, and we decided to evaluate how many relaying parties out there would be vulnerable to those that we found. And this is what it looked like in May 2023, so last year. 82.8% of all relaying parties on the internet were vulnerable to at least one of the issues that we found. Now, before coming to Black Hat, we decided to rerun these measurements and see how things have evolved in 1 year. And we reran these measurements on the 30th of July 2024, so last week, I think. And this is what it looks like. It's better, but it's not as good as one would hope. There is still 41.2% of all relaying parties that people are using that are unpatched, not upgraded, and therefore still vulnerable to things that we discovered and disclosed since last year. And for a protocol that is on the cusp of becoming sort of a standard for routing security, this is not good practice. This is not good news. So because bad things come in threes, we also have another problem that we found. So as we were running all of these tests with Cure, we were operating in a closed system. We had an isolated test bed. And sometimes we found that we were creating objects that we were feeding to all the relaying parties at the same time. No crashes were happening, no errors were being logged in the log files, but the relaying parties were all giving us different results, different outputs. And we checked the code, we checked the implementations, and what we eventually found out was that for those processing steps that were not very strictly defined or explained in the standard, the different vendors had taken the liberty to be creative in how they were going to do the processing. So the next step was to check if these inconsistencies were also present on the internet, or were they just triggered by some very obscure path that our fuzzer was finding. And this is how it looked like at the time. And frankly speaking, even if you were to run the same experiment today, you would find the same situation. So global inconsistencies were, in fact, present on the internet. No two relaying parties are going to give you the same exact output. And sometimes these discrepancies amount up to several thousands. And again, we decided to look into why this was exactly happening. So we repurposed Cure a little bit. We changed it in order to do this differential analysis of the actual RPKI data on the internet. And one of the examples that we're going to show, which is the most egregious one, is the Amazon example. So Amazon did all the right things. It was protecting its prefixes. It issued ROAs. It was doing everything according to the book. But one particular implementation was being a bit finicky. So one implementation had a very strict set of headers that it was allowed in the certificates of the RPKI objects. If for some reason the certificate included a header not in that very strict list, it would discard the entire certificate. And in this particular case, Amazon had the organization name header in their certificates. A pretty benign header, very commonly used. But for one implementation, this was a deal breaker. They would discard the entire certificate. And because of the cryptographic nature of the objects in the RPKI repositories, if you discard the certificates, you're going to also discard all the associated objects with it, which included a bunch of ROAs, which led to 6,405 prefixes in Amazon not being protected by all of those entities that were using this particular implementation. Of course, we also found other instances, but the effect of those instances was much less than this one. This was the biggest situation that we had that we also had to disclose at some point. So this is a list of all the issues that we found, and the next step was, of course, disclosing them to the vendors to get them fixed as soon as possible. And at this point, Nicholas is going to take us through the process.
Yes, thank you. Right, so after finding all these vulnerabilities and problems, we, of course, had to disclose them to the vendors. And for this disclosure, we sent out emails in July last year, not this year. And we got very different reactions by the vendors, which we would like to share on the next slides because they were quite, how you said, like colorful. So let's start with the easiest example. So vendor 1, we send out the disclosure email. We immediately got a confirmation that they received the email and are looking into it. Then we had a little bit of back and forth with questions and answers, which admittedly was also our mistake because we didn't include a proof of concept at first. Whoops. But then everything got solved, and after 5 days, they could start developing the patches. Now, this was nice. It was a very pleasant interaction. Let's go to vendor number 2. And we don't want to name and shame here, so we anonymize the vendors. Same process. We sent the initial disclosure email. We got a confirmation. Then we didn't hear back from them for 2 months, which I guess fair enough. People are busy. But when they actually sent the next email, they were like, yeah, we tried to reproduce your problem. It doesn't manifest anymore in the newest version, so it seems like the bug is fixed. Now, when we received this email, we were first a little bit shocked because we thought this was our mistake. We didn't test it on the newest version, and maybe they already fixed it. Then we looked into this, and it turned out they hadn't actually fixed the bug. They just changed the way we used for the proof of concept. So the proof of concept didn't work, but the bug was still there. So we adapted the proof of concept, and then it worked, and then they developed the patch. Now, there was a big learning for us, because we would almost have overlooked this, because he was right. The proof of concept didn't work anymore. So we thought, yeah, maybe the problem is fixed, but only the path to the vulnerability changed. So there's a learning maybe for you too. If something in the software was changed, still check if the vulnerability was fixed, and it's not only by accident that your vector to the vulnerability was fixed. And now let's get to the most colorful interaction, vendor number 3. So for vendor number 3, we also sent out the disclosure email, and we received silence, which is not completely true. We did receive some feedback because they closed our ticket. So we opened the ticket, 2 hours later, they closed the ticket. We tried again 1 month later, and the same thing happened. Within hours, they closed our ticket. And we kept going, we kept sending new emails, and always the same thing would happen, until at one point we wrote to them and said, yeah, we will publish this within the next days, please fix it. And still nothing, they still closed the ticket. And then months later, we checked their repository for a different research project, and then they had archived it. So they deprecated the software without telling us, which confused us a little bit, because also most of the vulnerabilities we found would have been quite easy to fix. And if they would have asked, we would also have helped them, right? Yeah, but I guess they didn't want to. Now, the learning for us at this point was that it was still good that we kept trying, because at one point, at least, we achieved deprecation, which I guess is better than nothing, because then people can change what they're using and not be vulnerable anymore to the problems. And with this, let's come to our conclusion. So the first takeaway from our research is that RPKI is a core internet security protocol. And it's getting continuously more deployed, and it's actually quite good. So if anyone is using BGP, maybe as a network admin in this room, think about using RPKI, because the technology has really evolved and it's really very good. But the software maturity in places is partially not yet production ready, but it is getting there. Now, the second takeaway is that patches do not come as fast as we would like. So some vendors might not patch at all, and others will patch, but only very late. And as Donika explained, we saw still almost half of the RPs on the internet still vulnerable. So if anyone here is running their own RP, then please patch your software, because the vulnerabilities are actually quite severe. And the last takeaway from our work is that fuzzing cryptography is very hard. And it's hard because it's complex, but complexity also leads to vulnerabilities, and usually cryptography is used in places where you really want security. So we need more tools that look into the security of these cryptographic protocols, and maybe even need more fuzzers which are built to test the security and resilience of these protocols. And with this, we're at the end of our presentation. If you have any questions, we have 2 minutes left. So feel free to come up to the mic. And if you want, you can also come to the wrap-up room after this presentation if you want to ask us in person. Thank you.